Hey deep divers, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Ever get a bill that makes you do a double take, like hold up, is this a typo? Today we're unpacking a story that started with a shocking funeral bill, but trust me, it goes way deeper than that. We're going back to 2020. Vanessa Guillén, a young soldier stationed at Fort Hood, is tragically murdered. Then President Trump invites her grieving family to the White House. Seems like a gesture of support, right? Well, according to reporting in The Atlantic, things take a pretty wild turn when a $60,000 funeral bill enters the picture. The Atlantic claims that Trump, who initially offered to cover the funeral expenses, allegedly flew off the handle when he saw the bill. There are even reports of him using some pretty offensive language about the cost of, and I quote, burying a Mexican.
This kind of inflammatory rhetoric, especially towards the Latinx community, wasn't new for Trump. If we look at his history, this incident fits into a larger pattern of divisive language.
Right. But here's where things get a little murky. The family's attorney confirmed that the bill was actually covered by donations and the Army. Plus, the Guillén family publicly praised Trump for his support. So, what's the real story here?
It makes you wonder what was happening behind closed doors. Was the family pressured to portray a certain image? Could their experience with Trump have been different in private? These are questions worth considering.
Okay, so we've got this explosive funeral bill situation, conflicting narratives, and a whole lot of questions. But there's a much bigger issue at play here, right?
Absolutely. Vanessa Guillén's murder wasn't an isolated incident. It ripped the lid off a deeply disturbing culture of sexual harassment and assault at Fort Hood.
This case triggered a massive investigation, and the findings were truly horrifying.
Think about this. The investigation uncovered a staggering 217 unreported accounts of sexual harassment and 93 credible accounts of sexual assault. These numbers point to a systemic issue within the military, allowing this toxic environment to thrive.
That's just mind-blowing. And for our listeners, this is more than just a political story or a military story. This is about power, accountability, and how easily vulnerable individuals can be silenced.
Fort Hood was actually renamed to Fort Cavazos last year. It's a gesture towards change. But is it enough? Real change requires more than just symbolic actions.
And that's what we'll be digging into next. Don't go anywhere, deep divers. Part 2 is coming up right after this.
Welcome back, deep divers. We're picking up where we left off, peeling back the layers of this complex and deeply troubling story.
Okay, so remember that explosive comment Trump allegedly made about the cost of, and I'm quoting here, burying a Mexican? Well, his spokesperson has come out swinging, calling it a flat-out lie, fabricated right before the election.
And to add to the mix, the Guillén family has publicly expressed gratitude for Trump's support during that time, so we have these conflicting narratives swirling around, which can make it hard to know what to believe.
This is where critical thinking becomes super important, right? We can't just blindly accept one version of the story. We have to weigh the evidence, consider the different perspectives, and, draw our own conclusions.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface and asking those tough questions. But let's shift gears back to the heart of this tragedy. Vanessa Guillén's murder at Fort Hood, as we discussed earlier. The investigation revealed a deeply disturbing pattern of sexual harassment and assault at the base.
And I think it's crucial that we don't let the political back and forth overshadow this central issue. The focus needs to remain on the systemic failures that ultimately led to Vanessa's death.
Absolutely. Remember those staggering numbers we talked about? 217 unreported accounts of sexual harassment and 93 credible accounts of sexual assault. That paints a pretty horrifying picture.
It really does. And those numbers don't just point to a few bad apples. They point to a pervasive and deeply ingrained problem within the military. This demands immediate and comprehensive action.
And what's even more disturbing is that this isn't just a problem at Fort Hood. Vanessa Guillén's case ignited a national conversation about sexual assault and harassment in the military as a whole. There were calls for reform and accountability across all branches.
Right. And this is where the renaming of Fort Hood to Fort Cavazos comes into play. It's a symbolic gesture, an attempt to acknowledge the need for change. But as we discussed earlier, is that enough?
Symbolic gestures are important, but they can't be the end of the story. Real lasting change requires a fundamental shift in the culture, a commitment to creating an environment where everyone feels safe and respected.
And that means addressing the power dynamics that often silence victims and protect perpetrators. It's about holding those in positions of authority accountable for creating and allowing a culture where these abuses can flourish.
So For those of us who aren't in the military, what can we take away from this story? How can we connect with these issues?
Well, I think it's a powerful reminder that these issues of power, abuse, and accountability aren't confined to the military. They exist in many institutions, in workplaces, in communities, everywhere.
It's about recognizing those dynamics in our own lives and speaking out against them. Wherever we encounter them, we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
And for me, the most important takeaway is the importance of believing victims and supporting survivors. We need to amplify the voices of those who've been silenced for far too long and demand justice for those who have been wronged.
This story is undeniably tragic, but it's also a call to action. We can't afford to be complacent. We have a responsibility to fight for change, to create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. And that fight starts right now.
And that brings us to the end of part 2. Stay tuned for the final part, where we'll explore how we can all be a part of creating lasting change. We're back, deep divers, for the final part of our deep dive. This case has been a whirlwind, hasn't it? We started with a shocking funeral bill and ended up confronting the dark reality of sexual assault within the military.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most sensational headlines can actually lead us to uncover much deeper systemic issues.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of looking beyond the surface. We can't just accept the information we're given at face value. We have to dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge our own assumptions.
And critical thinking is essential, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides. We need to be discerning consumers of information and always asking ourselves, who benefits from this narrative? What are the underlying power dynamics at play?
For me, Vanessa Guillén's story really highlights the importance of amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized and silenced.
You're right. For far too long, victims of sexual assault, particularly within institutions like the military, have been silenced. Their stories have been ignored, dismissed, or even buried.
And it's our responsibility to listen to those stories, to believe survivors, and to demand justice for those who have been wronged. But it goes beyond just listening, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's about holding those in positions of power accountable. We need to challenge the systems that allow these abuses to occur and work towards creating a culture where everyone feels safe and respected.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the question that keeps coming back to me is, what can each of us do to create lasting change? It feels like such a big, overwhelming problem.
It can feel that way, but change starts with each of us. It starts with awareness, education, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. We need to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations, to speak out against injustice, and to support organizations that are fighting for change.
It also means using our voices to support leaders who prioritize these issues, leaders who are genuinely committed to creating a more just and equitable world.
And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long and often difficult journey, but it's a journey worth taking.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparks some critical thinking, maybe some challenging conversations, and hopefully even some inspiration to make a difference. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting us know your thoughts. Until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.